So last week in fantasy football, there were some absolutely unpredictably high-scoring defenses in Week 9 fantasy football. This week, Week 10 fantasy football, we've got a lot of injuries still, and we've got lots of bye weeks to some really good defenses on this list. So there's a lot of change up yet again. And I think some more predictable defensive scoring right here. So I do it every single week. I am going through the top 12 defense rankings for Week 10 fantasy football, guys. And I am one of the only fantasy football YouTubers who covers defense in fantasy football on a weekly basis. So please go down there to drop a like on this video and subscribe to the channel to show your support. And once I hit 7,500 subscribers, I'm going to be giving away a lot of FFN hats. So help me get there as fast as possible. Going down there, dropping a like, and subscribing to the channel. So let's go ahead and dive through these rankings right now. So number one, really shouldn't surprise you when you see how good this defense has been all year long from a fantasy football perspective. And when you see the matchup, the Dallas Cowboys are a smash play in Week 10 fantasy football. You can see the numbers on the screen. Dallas has been outrageously good. You do not see defenses putting up these types of numbers in fantasy football. And we are 10 weeks deep now. That means that the Dallas Cowboys, they've had their bye week already, so they've played 8 games, but they are averaging 12.5 fantasy points per game and almost 3 sacks per game. And they're just getting so many turnovers that they didn't end up being a great defense last week. And I had called that and said they were going to be a good play because Philadelphia has turned the ball over quite a bit. Philadelphia had a pretty clean running game. The Giants are the exact opposite when it comes to the way they run their offense. And now they're down to their third string quarterback, Tommy DeVito. It's going to be really ugly for the Dallas Cowboys. I mean, they're just going to take an absolute hammer and just bludgeon the New York Giants this week. It's going to be ugly, but it's going to be great for your defense if you've got the Dallas Cowboys in Week 10 fantasy football. The number 2 defense, I've got the Baltimore Ravens defense here taking on the Cleveland Browns. So there's a couple reasons for this right now. Number one, the Baltimore Ravens are opening as 6-point betting favorites. And I'm not usually a huge betting line guy, but this is a prime example of how good the Baltimore Ravens has been. In a divisional matchup, they're opening up against a 6-point home favorite against the Cleveland Browns, and there's an obvious reason why. Their defense has been outrageously good. We were just talking about the Cowboys defense. The Baltimore Ravens have the number 2 defense in fantasy football right now. They're averaging 10 fantasy points per game. And everything else on a per game basis is outrageous. They're almost averaging 4 sacks per game. And they're averaging over 2 turnovers per game. The Baltimore Ravens have a tremendous defense. And they're taking on Cleveland, who has been... They looked better offensively last week, but they've been very unstable for the entire year. I really like Baltimore's defense again this week. Off of a great week that they already had last week, I think Baltimore does it all over again. The number 3 defense, I've got the Indianapolis Colts here taking on the New England Patriots in New England. So for weeks, I had said for several times this season, I said Indianapolis is a good defensive play. And it never turned out that way until Week 9 fantasy football when the Colts defense absolutely went off for 20 plus points because they had 2 house calls on interception returns. They had 2 pick sixes, both done by Kenny Moore. I'm not predicting that all over again. I'm not saying that that's going to happen, but here's what we do know. They're taking on an offense that's just as bad as the Carolina Panthers. And they're also just as turnover prone. Mac Jones has thrown lots of interceptions. There's been lots of fumbles, and their offense is just weaker than ever right now. So this matchup is just as good this week for the Colts as it was last week. That's the reason the Colts are here in the top 12 for 2 weeks straight, because they capitalized last week on just as bad of an offense, and they've got the same exact thing again. The Colts are going to be a good defensive play this week. I really, really like the Colts defense in Week 10 fantasy football. The number 4 defense, I've got the Seattle Seahawks making a big-time bounce-back game against the Washington Commanders. So here's the thing about the Seahawks defense last week. I came into the week and I said, in my must-start and sit defenses video, I said, in a pinch, you can play the Seahawks. I hope to God you did not listen to me on that one, because that was a horrible call. They have 37 points hung right on top of them against Baltimore. That was Baltimore, a team that's red hot right now, has one of the best offenses in football, and they're as good as anybody right now. They're taking on the Commanders this week. And the Commanders, yes, they beat the Patriots last week. A couple weeks ago, they had a good game. The Commanders are also, much like the Cleveland Browns, a very unstable offense, and their quarterback is simply just not up to par on a week-to-week basis. Now, on the other hand, the Seahawks defense, the numbers before last week were a lot better, and these are still not bad numbers at all. The Seahawks defense is still averaging 9 fantasy points per game, and that was after they got bludgeoned last week against Baltimore, because Seattle's defense is aggressive. You can see they're getting after your quarterback at over 3 sacks per game. They're also getting turnovers on you as well. The Seahawks defense is very aggressive, and I really like the Seahawks to have a massive bounce back week against the Washington Commanders. The Bills defense at number 5 here, taking on the Denver Broncos on Monday night in Buffalo. Buffalo, as a team, is a worrisome team for me personally. I've got my guard up. I've got a lot of questions about Buffalo, mainly on their offense. Their defense still looks really, really good. And the numbers on the screen, you can see back them up perfectly right now. Buffalo's defense is definitely still a top-tier defense in fantasy football. They're still averaging 9 fantasy points per game, and they're getting after your quarterback as well. The problem is Buffalo's offense, but that doesn't change the fact that this matchup is great. Denver's offensive line sucks, and Buffalo gets after your quarterback. That right there is a fantastic matchup alone. Buffalo also causes turnovers, and Denver has been not exactly great in that department either. Buffalo's defense this week is a really good hammer play, and they might be on waivers right now because they just played the Bengals. So the reason it comes out before waivers is because I want you guys to have an opportunity to get the Bills defense on waivers this week, because they might be on in your league. So make sure to check it out, because the Bills are a solid play. The Saints defense here at number 6, taking on the Minnesota Vikings. So last week, I had the Saints inside the top 3, and they ended up having a fantastic week. Well, that was obvious to see. They played the Chicago Bears last week, and if you can't do well against the Chicago Bears defensively, you don't deserve to be back here ever again. That's the reality. But the problem is this week, they're taking on the Minnesota Vikings, who are a better offense than the Bears are. With Josh Dobbs, immediately, they became a better offense than the Bears have been basically all season long. I understand it. It was a fun week for Josh Dobbs, and he came in nights before and studied a little bit and won the game for him. It's a much different week this week for the Minnesota Vikings. They did not take on the New Orleans Saints defense last week. They took on the Atlanta Falcons defense, and they have a terrible defense. New Orleans defense, you can see on the screen, this is an elite defense right here. Now, from a fantasy points per game, they're not tremendous, but they're not bad. They're averaging right around 9 fantasy points per game. But they hold you to so little, and Minnesota's going to have a tough time this week against the Saints, and that's why I really like them as a middle tier, middle of the pack defensive play this week. The Steelers defense at number 7 here, taking on the Green Bay Packers in Pittsburgh this week. The Pittsburgh Steelers, every single week, I say the same thing, which is that they're on here because they create turnovers. They're really not great at holding you from a lot of yardage. They're a classic bend but don't break defense that is also very key on getting at your quarterback and getting turnovers. And Green Bay's offensive line has weakened, and they're also not very good offensively as far as holding onto the ball and not making mistakes. Jordan Love, they barely let him throw down the field. I think that the Steelers are going to get after Jordan Love this week. At home, I think they're going to get after Jordan Love because the Green Bay Packers offensive line is simply not great, and the Pittsburgh Steelers, they're scoring 10 fantasy points per game, and the reasons why is because they get your quarterback, and they also create a lot of havoc, creating turnovers for your offense. The Raiders defense at number 8 here, taking on the New York Jets at home Las Vegas. So I got to give you guys lots of credit here. If you did not watch my What I Got Right and What I Got Wrong live stream on Monday night, you don't know this, so I want to address everybody watching. You guys made a great call. The Raiders defense last week was a fantastic play, and I said don't play them. I was wrong on this one. The Raiders defense is actually really solid, and they look way more energized without Josh McDaniels in the building holding them back. And the matchup, again, is very, very good. This is a primetime game, which I'm not saying that the Raiders are some great primetime team. Obviously, they're not. But Zach Wilson, we just watched what he did on primetime on Monday night. He was horrendous. So if they can get that version of Zach Wilson again, they could create a turnover too, and they're definitely getting after him because the Jets' offensive line is not good, and Max Crosby is the reason that the Raiders are actually averaging a decent number of sacks per game. So the Raiders' defense this week, to me, They're going against Zach Wilson in primetime again. Everything really lines up in this type of matchup for me again. The Jets defense is also a top 10 defense as well. Because like I said with the Minnesota Vikings got a very easy opponent last week against the Atlanta Falcons. They won that game. Well, the Raiders had a even easier opponent against the Giants, and they bludgeoned them. Now, yes, I will give Raiders credit. They look way more energetic and enthusiastic as a whole team without Josh McDaniels and now with Antonio Pierce, former player. But it doesn't change the fact that the Raiders are taking on an elite defense. And honestly, if you watch the first half of the game, Jets versus Chargers, you saw that the Jets were elite. They were elite at stopping the Chargers for a while. Their offense was just not on the field that long. If they can get a couple turnovers here against the Raiders, it doesn't matter if the Jets win this game or not. If they can get a couple turnovers, they can absolutely make some massive noise and be a good fantasy play for you, and that's what I expect as a top 10 defense this week. The Jaguars defense taking on the San Francisco 49ers at home in Jacksonville. This one is where it gets a little bit dicey right here. Obviously, this tier right here, there's some potential issues here. Again, lots of bye weeks, lots of injuries to the defensive side of the ball. It's going to shake things up here. Here's what we know about the Jaguars defense. Numbers on the screen do not lie. They've been a very, very good fantasy defense this year. They're averaging 9 fantasy points per game. The problem is they're not exactly getting after your quarterback as much. They're basically averaging 2 sacks per game exactly. Now, I would love to see that number higher, but what they are doing is they're getting turnovers, especially in the interception department. Their secondary is playing very tight press coverage, and they're getting all over these wide receivers and forcing interceptions. What's Brock Purdy's problem been over the past several weeks? He's throwing picks. He's making more mistakes. So if they don't have to win this game for them to be a decent fantasy play for you. They're top 10 for a reason. They're not at the top for a reason. I don't think that this is going to be a dominant performance by Jacksonville, but what I do think is I think that Brock Purdy, with the mistakes he's making lately, I think Jacksonville could capitalize because they specialize in getting interceptions from your opposing quarterback, and that's been exactly what Brock Purdy's problem has been. Number 11, the Bengals defense makes it inside again, and they're taking on the Houston Texans. Obviously, Houston's coming off a 5-touchdown performance from CJ Stroud. It was excellent. Here's the thing. Tampa Bay's defense is not as strong as Cincinnati's, and especially their secondary. Cincinnati's secondary is very, very strong. We just got done talking about the Jags. Well, the other team tied with them in interceptions is Cincinnati. They've also got 11 interceptions this year as well. And Cincinnati, the difference between them and the Jags, they get after your quarterback more. Trey Hendrickson, Sam Hubbard on one side and the other, those two guys get after your quarterback. Houston is going to struggle more this week than they did against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I'll take that to the bank right here. Cincinnati's got a great defense. They've got a great defensive coordinator. I like them as a back-end top 12 defense in Week 10 fantasy football. And the last defense of the week, we are going with the Cleveland Browns defense, and they are taking on the Baltimore Ravens in Baltimore. Now, like I said, we had to make some tough decisions here in this tier. There's a lot of close matchups. Detroit versus the Chargers. I couldn't put any of those defenses in here this week. I had to go with the Browns, and I'll tell you why I did. Number one, divisional matchups are always very unpredictable, and they're very tough to hammer home. One of the reasons why the Browns and Baltimore Ravens have the lowest over-under of the week at 37.5 points is because it's a divisional matchup. Now, Baltimore's favored by 6 points in this game, but again, if the Browns don't allow a 30-point game from Baltimore and they get a couple turnovers, it's possible, and the Pittsburgh Steelers did it several weeks back. Divisional games for Lamar Jackson are not as easy for NFC games because these teams see Lamar Jackson very frequently. So I do think there's a chance here that the Browns could get a couple turnovers, and that's why they're inside the top 12. And as I do every single week, I will be giving you my favorite defense to pick up for next week. In advance for Week 11, if you have the roster space, I really like getting the Detroit Lions. If you could stash them on your bench for this week, for next week, because they're taking on the Chicago Bears in Detroit. So Detroit is obviously coming off a bye week. That means that their defense was probably not already rostered in the first place. And there's probably not too many people tempted to pick up their defense off the waivers, if they are on waivers, because they have the Chargers on tap this week. But the Detroit Lions defense, they've been a very, very good fantasy defense. They get after your quarterback. They create turnovers. They run the ball well, which gives their defense lots of time to recover on the sidelines. And they will be taking on the Bears, who will be down maybe another game. And the Bears' offense has been so anemic and also horrendous at maintaining the ball. They turn the ball over a lot. That's going to work in Detroit's favor. If you have the roster space and you can afford to put them on your bench for this week, Detroit is a great defense, and they are my favorite defense to pick up in advance for next week. So let me know what you think of the defensive rankings in the comments below and what questions you need answered for Week 10 Fantasy Football. And if you want to see the top 30 wide receiver rankings for Week 10 Fantasy Football, click on this video right here.